I find this section that you have on environment and anthropology really interesting. And notice again, I did not mention geography. Particularly the issue of TEK and Inuit qaujimajatuqangit. Mostly because for many people, they conflate TEK with the whole of Inuit qaujimajatuqangit. And if anything, it's only what is visible to us that we can comprehend. Basically how to hunt, maybe tinkering with technology and so on and so forth. And as I've said earlier, Inuit are amazing, but TEK is just scratching the surface of Inuit knowledge, however you want to term it, IQ, Inuit qaujimajatuqangit. And one of the things, as I say, I wrote an article about this, which was titled "From TEK to IQ," from cultural ecology to Inuit qaujimajatuqangit. Sorry about that. Which was published in Arctic Anthropology. Actually, as I believe it was a festschrift for Rick Condon, but who he and I did some work together once upon a time. But hunting, clearly Inuit hunting is done within a value system, which is done within an ontological system. And I think you and Yarrick have written very well about the ontological, or close to what we might call. I don't believe in the ontological term particularly. I think we should be looking more for where there's coincidence than difference. And one of the reasons I don't really do research on the ontological is I don't have the vocabulary to do it. And if I did, I still wouldn't understand it in the way Inuit understand things. I just believe that. So, I think there's been more of a turn towards what's really IQ, although only by a few people who really have spent time with Inuit. One of the things that I think's really been lost in research is spending time with people. I don't care whether it's Papua New Guinea or the San or with Inuit. As I say, I was in Greenland for X amount of time. I would never write about Greenland. I wasn't there long enough. I have impressions, and I could certainly compare certain things to Inuit. I was fascinated with the way hunting, fishing, and herding were unionized, the KNPK. And, we talk about hunter support programs, maybe a union type operation, except then you're getting into privatizing wildlife. So I once got into a real argument in public with Charlie Watt over commercializing caribou. I thought it was a horrible idea. That, for one thing, it smacked of domesticating reindeer, if only you were going to corral them and so on. But more than anything else, what happened? My argument with Charlie was, what happens when, when times are good, you can catch enough caribou to sell and also to share. But what happens when caribou crash, go into a decline, which they inevitably do? That's part of Inuit qaujimajatuqangit. And then the hunter says, well, if I share, I won't have money to hunt. But if I sell, I'm doing something wrong. I don't have food to share. To me, it was such a dilemma that why go that way at all? And I don't believe that even with the Northern support programs, the way the guaranteed income program has been used in Nunavik, that people should actually, I think it puts all Inuit in a real dilemma. Are we supporting hunting or are we buying food? Period. You know, so these are more than existential questions, in a sense, or are existential questions that I don't think are really thought about during policy discussions, mostly because I don't think that many Inuit are really involved in policy discussions in a really concrete way. And that'll lead me over to work I did for the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board. It was through a consulting firm in Ottawa, Arluk. I don't know if they still exist. Of all things, I was asked to develop materials so they could develop a TEK policy. And I thought this was the most ironic thing. I mean, a white guy doing this. And so the first report I gave them, and it's long. It's like, what I did was I went through all the literature on all the species, and until my eyes fell out of my head. And they loved it. And a couple of years later, they went back to the firm, and they explicitly asked for me to give them a policy-directed paper, which wound up 12 pages. And what it said was, no decision should be made until you have a committee of elders that the biologists sit down with and you argue out your points. And this kind of speaks to that part about conservation or environmentalism or whatever. And because without that, you're never going to have a policy that works. People are never going, they may obey it, but they're not going to be happy with it. It's going to be something that was imposed. And yeah, it was just a little 12-page thing. I charged them an arm and a leg for it. And went up there and presented it, and the Inuit on the board loved it, and the white guys hated it. And T.S. That's all I could say. But the Inuit, people had told me who read the seal book, Inuit liked it. People really liked this because it was a multi-stage process of not just gathering the data and then putting it into some mill being analyzed in Ottawa or something. The analysis would be north with one white and one Inuk working on walrus or on polar bear or whatever. And then up to this council, so to speak, or committee of elders and biologists, not bureaucrats. Biologists don't talk very often to the guys that may go out in the field as polar bear monitors maybe, but they don't talk to Inuit in the communities. So I don't know whatever happened to that. I'm sure not very much. Probably a lot of turnover. I know the white biologist at Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, it probably turns over about every 2 years. So, as I said, I'm going to pass on talking about pollution and hot technologies. I have no only opinion that doesn't go very far. But narwhal hunting was interesting because I had a student who was came to me from biology. He was an evolutionary biologist. And I don't know if he wanted to have the experience of social science. I don't know exactly what his motivation was. But he was well schooled in evolutionary ecological theory, which I had played around with. But as I said, I'm mostly interested in when it doesn't work, why it doesn't work. And so we put together this project, a narwhal project in Pond Inlet, because they have a 100 quota, for one thing. Clyde had a much lower quota. And I wanted to go back to Mitimatalik and visit. I hadn't been there since Father Mary died. So it was kind of and I had known, along with Inuit there, quite a number of Clyde Inuit, a lot of intermarriage between Pond and Clyde. And then, because Clyde is really two different Inuit populations meet at Clyde. Those from Home Bay down Kikatajuak over towards Cumberland Sound. And then Pond Inlet, Arctic Bay, they're Igloo Inuit, even though they're, I forget what they call them, you know, North Baffin or something, East Baffin, but they're Igalingmut. The main dialect in Clyde is Igalingmut. And it was convenient because I don't know if you knew Herman Steltner, Herman the German. He did trained Inuit as meteorologists and stuff. He didn't work for government. He had been a meteorologist in the Luftwaffe. And Herman moved north. I don't know what Herman did other than train Inuit, but I'm sure he did lots of things. And he had built this incredible place in Pond Inlet, 2 stories. And I don't know if you've been in Pond. Yeah, down at the far end of the village, it was painted brown. It had 2 extensions and a tower in the middle. That's where I had my students stay. And there was all kinds of stuff in there, including he was fabricating Thule and Dorset artifacts, casting them for tourism sales and stuff. It was really, Herman had long died. I knew his daughter, Dorothy Kumanapik, but anyway, so just to, test out with somebody who really knew the theory. And I don't know if it was super successful, but it was, from my point of view, and from the student's point of view, a fun thing to do. He had 3 narwhal seasons up there. He was Korean and Canadian. And so like Nobuhiro, I told him he'd fit right in. Just tell him he had been taken to residential school and didn't speak Inuktitut anymore. What the hell, right? And got along quite, people really liked him. He's now for at least, it's got to be going on 15, 20 years. He's the main biologist for NTI. He's a hell of a good biologist. And it was a good project, a good PhD project. I would like to have run it a couple of more seasons, but you do what you do with the money you have. So, but the alliance between Inuit and ecologists, I guess you would say I've got a pretty negative bias on all of this, and maybe I should leave it at that. Mostly because I don't think they ever work beyond, and apologies to oceanographer here, but to preconceived ideas from the South. Like Fickrit's really good, Fickrit Burkus around fisheries. He spent a lot of time with Cree and so on. But by and large, even the ecologists, I don't take the time. This is not a good story, and it's all it is a story. Maybe some people would consider it a parable. Back when they were talking about renewing or reviving seismic testing in Baffin Bay, because there was seismic testing done in the 70s. There's an oil seep north of Clyde River in a place called Swiss Bay, which is part of Samford Fjord. And they did some seismic then, but it went to the Supreme Court. And I put together all kinds of stuff for Kikatani, Inuit Association, and so on. But, and Greenpeace became involved, and you may know that from your work with evangelical groups. This is another evangelical group of sorts. But it was a really interesting alliance, I think. As far as it went, it was very much political on the part of Clyde, although Jerry Natanay, who was mayor, was very sincere. But the correspondence in, for instance, the Natsiak News was, how could you align with these people, and so on and so forth. But Jerry did a good job. But the Greenpeace people came up, and they did a nice thing in the community. They put in solar panels in the community center. In fact, the community sells power to the power company when they have surplus. But what pops in my mind, these guys, several women, several men, they were there for several weeks. I don't know if they had ever read anything about Inuit, let alone about Clyde River. So they didn't know who I was. That was interesting. But because I had trashed Greenpeace at one point. And so they wanted to have, I think they were flying out the next day or two, putting together a big meal to thank the community. And they made a caribou chili, which was great, except they spiced it like chili. And Inuit don't like spices. I can make the mildest chili and people won't eat it. You know, and all I could think of was, geez, didn't you ask people what their tastes were? Down here, you would ask someone, do you eat pork? Are you vegan? You didn't ask people what they would eat? Well, it had caribou in it. Yeah, but if you make it so it's unpalatable, so I don't know if that's not a good example, but I think most ecologists, first and foremost, are representative of the species they study, which is fine. But we all develop an expertise. I don't know if you can ever learn everything about animals, but you can probably come relatively close. There may be rogue animals, whatever, but you never learn everything about somebody else's culture until you've lived in it. And I mean really lived in it, not like me or you or even Bernard or Louis Jacques or even Hugh Brody. You know, we all have what we're really good at, but we don't have the totality of things. And for ecologists, most of them they're trained in the South, and they come north with ideas about everything from prey density and allowable catch levels and so on and so forth, that, you know, may make good sense, but have to be negotiated. I mean, after all, wildlife management is about managing people. It's not about managing animals. Nobody manages bowhead whales. They say they do, but what they do is they restrict Japanese hunting or hunting out of the Orkneys or wherever. So it's really social science, you know. And that was my one complaint with Eric Bourne's study about doing this harvest study by telephone, which I thought was a bad idea in the first place. But they do have phone service in Greenland. Was you really need to sit down with people. And because nobody on the phone is going to tell you, they're either going to hang up on you, they're not going to tell you you're wrong, or they'll just pretend they're out of town. So I think from the ecologist side of things, it's probably a much more positive view than it is from the Inuit side. Because I think a lot of the ecologists don't ask the right questions. Not that it would blow up the models or anything, but they just assume that the models are straight up, and there's no need to talk about these things. And that's not everyone by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there are probably many more environmentalist ecologists, and they're not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination, who do a much better job now. But there are still a lot, and I've seen a lot over the years, who don't. Whether they're university biologists, I think university biologists come closer to dealing with people than the government biologists do, quite frankly, because they're restricted by policy. You know, ideally, we come from universities because we want to explore ideas, and not just our own. You know, so that's the fun thing of having women students. I have ideas, but they wouldn't go anywhere if I actually tried to implement them. It would be a disaster, I'm sure. I think that's about all I can say about TEK and IQ.
Very nice.
Except I like IQ because you know how that originated, don't you? The term IQ? Yeah.
I like it too.
White people have low IQs. I wish I had been at that meeting in Igloolik.